Hello, folks, and welcome back. Welcome to part two of our video looking at quantitative research, specifically participants and data collection. Okay, let's start with part B on our slides. Data collection, identifying how quantitative information is gathered. That's slide 11. Slide 12. Um, so we use tools for gathering quantitative data generally, and those tools are most commonly called instruments. These include tests and scales. So tests are things like achievement tests or max performance tests, aptitude tests, and intelligence tests. Scales are what the term we use to refer to when we're trying to measure some kind of construct, something that you can't necessarily observe directly, but that does exist, such as aspects of personality, motivation, or attitudes. And also, usually, we also collect demographic information. And these different types of items or these different instruments are combined often to on a questionnaire. So you might have a test that you're giving, but first you ask some demographic items, or a scale that you're interested in learning about, say personality traits, and it's followed by some demographic items, just so you have a tool for providing some statistical control later on. So let's talk about types of tests. There are cognitive tests. Performance tests are the most common. Basically, there are a certain number of items. They're scored correct or incorrect, and they're designed to assess the upper limits of knowledge or abilities. Now, achievement tests are usually focused on a specific content area, so a reading achievement test or a science achievement test, whereas aptitude tests are supposedly measuring cognitive skills acquired from overall life experiences. And the most famous of that is the Scholastic Aptitude Test. Now, it's used to predict future performance, but it's been found to be uh, not very reliable predictor of future performance. And we'll talk about specifically what I mean by reliability a little later on. The SAT, yeah, it's not very good at predicting anything except for perhaps the first year of college, how students do in the first year of college. But grade grade point average from high school is much better at predicting that. But anyway, aptitude tests are supposedly measuring general cognitive skills acquired from overall life experience. Now, some tests can be thought of as objective versus subjective in terms of how they're scored. Um, and there are some tests that are more focused on speed, rather, and other tests that may be more focused on power. Um, so in certain tests, it's all about how quickly can you access this information or perform in this task. Whereas others, it's how well can you do those things, and time is not as a factor. Okay. Um, Now, there are some tests that we would consider about affect. Okay, mental characteristics related to emotion, affect, emotion. Um, so, so it may be that an attitude or an interest scale is related to affect. How do these different things make you feel? And usually it's self-report, and they're usually called scales. And there are also attitude scales. For example, what an individual believes or perceives about themselves, others, activities, institutions, or situations. And the scales used in both affect and attitude, maybe things like a Likert scale. A Likert scale is just a way um, of scoring a response, and you've encountered lots of Likert scales in your life. Whenever, for example, when you do the course evaluations, anything that says, like strongly disagree, agree, you know, that kind of thing. Strongly disagree, disagree, agree, strongly agree, things like that. Where you have these different levels that you're asked to choose from. Um, and you can see that article that I mentioned on the slide for examples of Likert scale anchors. The anchors are what the choices are for the responses. Interest inventories, value tests, personality inventories. Um, these are all different types of generally attitude scales, and um, and now there's a difference in terms of how the test is scored. If there's a certain cutoff score between passing and failing, we call it a criterion test. We want to see whether or not those who take the test reach a certain criteria. Now, a norm reference test, on the other hand, is when we give, a large number of students or adults or clients a test, and we see, okay, um, the the top performers, what score do the top performers get? What score do the low performers get? And then we relate a new test taker to those scores. So it's basically based on a bell curve, okay? Based on some kind of comparison to other students or clients. That's a norm reference test. And for norm reference tests, we generally get a percentile score. You scored as well as or better than 90% of folks. If you were average, you scored as well as or better than 50% of folks, okay, who took the test or who were in our Norman group. And then now there's another way we use the word test, and that's statistical tests. And that's not something we give to participants in our study. That's something we do with the data that we receive. So we might perform a t-test or do an ANOVA or a chi-square or look at correlation or regression. That's another use of the word tests. So one question that often comes up is, what is an adequate number of participants? And this varies tremendously depending on the design of the study, but also depending on the statistical analytic techniques that are going to be used in the study. But I'm going to give you some rules of thumb here. If we're reading an article that's a true experiment or a quasi experiment, we might expect a minimum of about 15 participants in each group. Now this really varies. I've seen certain psych articles that were extremely well done, and maybe they only had 10 participants in each group. It's it varies, but we might be looking for a minimum of 15 participants in each group, just in general. With a single subject study, one participant is enough. That's why it's called a single subject study. But you might have a few, maybe 3 or 4. But what you're looking for there is data collected over a large number of points in time. So I might be expecting to see for each participant at least 10 data points, let's say. Now, for a correlational study, when you're relating one variable to another, you need more participants because the um, you haven't controlled for as much of the variation that normally exists. So you might need a minimum of 30 for a correlational study that relates variables. Depending on the statistical technique you're using, though, you might not be able to detect an effect unless you have at least 100 participants. It all depends. For a survey study, maybe you need about 350 individuals. It depends on the size of the population, the overall size of the population you're studying. So for if you're studying all teachers in the United States, actually no, it doesn't depend on the overall size of the population you're studying. It depends on the size of the effect that you're looking for. Um, I was studying all teachers in the United States, which is a large population, but the effects that I was looking for related to satisfaction, um, job satisfaction, for example, were rather small, and related to relationships between how they rated their principals and their colleagues and their students and their job satisfaction, for example. These effects tend to be small, so I needed several hundred individuals in my study. You see what I'm saying? Okay. So let's just go over some basic measurement language. The psychometrics of a test are the measurement or statistical characteristics. And these include reliability, which is basically the stability or consistency of scores. The idea, remember, with quantitative research is that we're trying to find out the truth, right? So, um, reliability relates to how close are we to the truth? How reliable is our test towards getting at the truth? Okay. The validity, on the other hand, is the accuracy or appropriateness of interpretation of the scores. Does the test measure what it says it's going to measure? Okay. And we can only validate relative to the group that took the test. So, does the test measure what it says it's going to measure for the third grade students, for example? Okay. Here's what we're looking for in terms of how the researchers that we're reading selected their test or survey or scale. Did they know the qualities of the test? Did they define the purpose of the study and the population? Were there a group of tests? We might consider it more valid if there was more than one tool used to measure a particular characteristic. There are, if you're doing your own study, there are online and hard copy repositories of different tests, like the Mental Measurements Yearbook or Tests in Print. That you can find it in certain pro-ed publications. There's the ETS test collection database, other sources, and definitely ask your professors if there's a test that they have access to, if there's a study that you're doing. And then finally, you can always develop your own test. And this is what individuals doing small studies in their own context often do. Teachers create their own tests. Counselors can create their own tests and interest inventories. Okay, let's talk about how good is the scale. How good is the tool that's being used to measure some characteristic? And in order to talk about that, we're talking about reliability and validity. So, reliability versus validity. One way to think about this is to think about someone shooting a bow and arrow. Okay? And you're aiming for a particular target. So let's say I have a test of happiness. I want to find out an individual's true happiness score on my happiness scale. Um, and I'll know that my test is both reliable and valid if I'm close to that true score or that target, whatever that true score is. Um, and if I'm centered on that true score, if I'm centered on that true score and I'm close to it. So um, this first uh, um, board, we see that the the arrow has hit reliably in the same place, right? But it's not around our target. So it's not really measuring, if this target represents happiness, it's not really measuring happiness, it's measuring something else. But it's reliably measuring it because the arrows are hitting pretty close together. Looking at this second board, we see that it looks like the person who's shooting the arrow is aiming, right? Is aiming for the target, but maybe their arm is very wobbly. And so the arrow is hitting um, around the target, but not on the target. Okay, so we're aiming in the right direction, so it's valid, but it's not reliably hitting the target. In fact, it hasn't hit the target at all. But we are, if you were to say on average, it looks like the person is aiming toward, is aiming in the right direction. Now, in this third example, the where they're aiming, it seems like it's someplace out here, because if there was going to be a, the spray of arrows, you can imagine that it might be somewhere around here. So it's not valid. It's not there. The person is not aiming toward the target, and it's also not reliable because the hits are not close together. It's not hitting the same place each time. And then finally, here's an example of um, um, an illustration of valid and reliable. So the arrow is hitting what we want. It's hitting that measure of happiness, let's say, and it's reliably hitting there. We shoot the arrow over and over, and we're reliably hitting the target that we want. Evidence of validity. There's content validity, criterion related validity, construct validity, consequential validity. You'll see these terms as you're reading papers, and basically they're just different types of validity. For example, content validity is the test measuring the in the domain or in the genre or in the subject or in the discipline that we're looking for. So, for example, do the items in my happiness scale actually relate to happiness? Criterion related validity is if people achieve a certain score on my scale, would others say that they're actually happy? If they pass my happiness test, do they actually seem like they're happy? Construct, how close is my scale to what we know about this theoretical construct of happiness? And consequential, do people behave in a way that shows that they're happy if they've passed my happiness test? Okay, what are the consequences of achieving a certain score on my test? Now, there are certain things that threaten validity: unclear directions, ambiguous items, a vocabulary that's above the level of the person who's taking the test. That happens a lot in tests for school age kids. Difficulty or difficult or complex sentence structure. When you are reading a scale at the back of someone's paper and you see some double negatives, you know that it may not have a valid the scores may not be valid, in part because people didn't understand the questions. Highly subjective scoring. This is why we use rubrics to reduce highly subjective scoring. Material that wasn't covered. Testing kids on something for example, that they haven't been taught, will reduce the validity of the test. Failure to follow procedures, if certain students get 30 minutes and another group gets 60 minutes, you may get scores that are not valid, not reflecting um, what they're designed to measure, relating in terms of one group of students versus another, and of course cheating. You're not going to get the true score for an individual if they have cheated. Finally, reliability is the extent to which tests consistently measure whatever it is they're measuring. That's that consistency. There are different ways to measure it. You may see things mentioned in papers like we did a test retest procedure, or we looked at how equivalent scores on this test were to another test that is well known, or we checked the internal consistency using Cronbach's alpha, which is just a statistical test to see if items are consistent. And then finally, inter-rater reliability, which is when we had two people score this test and we found out how much those two people agreed. Now, reliability coefficients are just statistics that relate to reliability. Usually they range from 0 to 1. And the minimum level differs by test, by the type of statistical test that's being used. Now, there are certain things that authors should mention when they're using various tests and scales in their studies. They to show that the scores are reliable and valid. So they might make citations to the literature indicating that the instrument was previously developed and used for research purposes. They may and probably should include the text of the items, at least some of the items, so that you can judge whether they are clear and unambiguous. And often they'll say, particularly if they develop their own test, that experts assess that the items on the instrument cover the appropriate content, and this is called content validity or face validity. And that's another way of demonstrating or arguing that their test is reliable and valid. Now, internal validity relates to how well is this test able to get at a person's true score on some kind of construct. Okay, and so there are a few ways to increase a study's internal validity, and so you may hear these things mentioned, and this may be something if you're ever doing your own test, your own research study that involves a test that you might want to do. Manipulating the conditions so they are as similar as possible between groups and across time, except for the treatment related to the independent variable. So if we're trying to find out the effect of a particular independent variable, it helps that if the other variables that affect the test takers are consistent. So that's that example of, did they have 30 minutes or did they have 60 minutes to take the test? We want consistency. And that'll make it easier for us to see whether or not some independent variable like our intervention had an effect. Randomly assigning individuals to groups. Again, that random assignment is to help control for the variation that normally exists in a population, and so that we get, some men and some women in each group. We get some, just people who have different backgrounds, a sprinkling of everybody in each group is our goal. And this way, existing differences among individual participants are spread across groups. Also, measuring other variables that need to be controlled, such as giving a pretest or assessing individuals for attitudes or behaviors that may be relevant to how they respond to a treatment. If you don't know where people started, it's hard to know how much they improved or how effective your intervention was. And so pretests help with that. External validity is about how well you can generalize, how well the results from you testing a specific group of people can be generalized to other groups of people. Okay? How well your sample, your results for your sample relates to other people in other places. So, you can increase the external validity by randomly selecting individuals from a list of all members of a population to participate in the study. And that's, external validity is a really good reason for doing random selection. Random selection is not always possible, but it does increase external validity. You can use procedures that encourage as many participants as possible to respond to the study's measurement instruments. So, for example, if you send out a survey, you want a high response rate. You want as many participants as possible because you're looking to get many different types of people to respond. And if the response rate is low, like 60% or lower, then the results may not generalize, since the people who chose not to respond may be different from the people who did respond. And then you can examine the demographic information obtained from the participants to determine whether the individuals who participated are similar to the larger group. Okay, did you have enough males? Did you have enough females? And so on. And that's the end of our tour of participants and data collection procedures. Have a good day, and I look forward to seeing you next time.